Why did Emperor Napoleon depose his brother? History has always remembered Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte as a titan, a general of unmatched brilliance, a strategist who bent maps to his will, and an emperor who crowned himself in defiance of God and tradition. But buried beneath the roaring tales of conquests and the thunder of cannon fire lies a far more intimate tragedy, one that didn't he play out on a battlefield, but in the cold, unforgiving terrain of brotherhood and power, because when Napoleon rose, he didn't want to rise alone. He wanted to build a dynasty, wanted to see the name Bonaparte rule, not just France, but all of Europe. And in this vision, his brothers were not his equals, they were his instruments. Perhaps no instrument was more tragically shaped, more painfully broken, than Joseph Bonaparte, the elder brother Napoleon would one day depose. Joseph Bonaparte was born in 1768, 1 year before Napoleon, on the rugged island of Corsica. From the very beginning, Joseph had the air of a philosopher. He was gentle in spirit, thoughtful in manner, more interested in ideas than in ambition. He read books with reverence, spoke softly, and imagined a life of quiet diplomacy. In contrast, his younger brother Napoleon was restless, intense, and fiercely focused. He devoured military theory, debated fiercely, and dreamed of altering the course of history. They loved each other, of that there is no doubt, but their paths, like their personalities, could not have been more different. And yet, as Napoleon's star rose through the ranks of the French military during the Revolution, he never forgot Joseph. He pulled him closer, wrapped him in his vision, and convinced himself that together they would build an empire that would outlast kings and kingdoms. In 1806, Napoleon handed Joseph the throne of Naples. It wasn't exactly a request, it was a declaration. "You will rule Naples," he said, as though it were a foregone conclusion. And Joseph, reluctant but loyal, accepted. He had no experience as a king, no passion for war, and no taste for conquest, but he did have a sense of duty. In Naples, Joseph surprised many. He enacted reforms, abolished feudal privileges, modernized the legal system, and even won the admiration of some locals. But he ruled like a thinker, not a soldier. He tried to build consensus, to govern with humanity, and that, in Napoleon's eyes, was weakness. Napoleon had already set his sights on Spain, a land torn by internal divisions and rotting under the weight of an inept monarchy. He believed Spain could be the key to European domination, a backdoor into British influence. In 1808, he summoned Joseph and informed him, without ceremony, that he was now to be king of Spain. Joseph was stunned. Spain was not Naples. It was proud, complicated, and deeply hostile to foreign interference. Joseph protested. He begged his brother to reconsider. But Napoleon would not hear of it. He deposed the Spanish king and forced Joseph onto the Spanish throne, against his will. From the moment Joseph arrived in Madrid, he was branded a usurper. The Spanish people rejected him. They didn't see a ruler, they saw a puppet, a foreigner installed by a foreign tyrant. Guerrilla warfare erupted across the country. Spanish resistance fighters attacked French convoys, assassinated collaborators, and ignited an unending chain of chaos. Joseph, ever the diplomat, tried to bring reform. He tried to reason. He tried to rule with moderation. But Spain didn't want moderation. It wanted freedom. And Joseph, tragically, had no idea how to govern a nation that had already decided to hate him. Meanwhile, Napoleon watched from Paris with growing fury. He sent Joseph letters filled with disdain and disappointment. He accused him of being indecisive, cowardly, soft. He didn't understand diplomacy, he only understood domination. To him, Joseph's attempts to bring peace were signs of weakness, not wisdom. And so, slowly, Napoleon began to pull power away from his brother, gave direct control of Spanish military forces to his marshals. He allowed generals like Soult, Suchet, and Ney to bypass Joseph entirely. The King of Spain was king in name only. His orders were ignored. His authority was mocked, and Joseph knew it. In private letters, he wrote of his despair, his humiliation, his deep sense of betrayal. He had given up everything: his peace, his home, his identity for a crown that meant nothing, and a brother who no longer respected him. In 1812, the situation worsened. Napoleon launched his disastrous invasion of Russia, draining French resources and stretching his empire thin. Spain, meanwhile, grew more volatile. The British, led by the relentless Duke of Wellington, poured in support to Spanish rebels. Town after town fell. The French army retreated. Joseph, caught in the middle, could do nothing. He had no control over his generals. He had no power to negotiate peace. He was trapped by politics, by history, and most painfully by blood. In 1813, the Battle of Vittoria sealed his fate. Allied forces crushed the French army, and Joseph fled Madrid for the last time. His reign was over. He would never return to Spain. Napoleon, though furious, said little publicly. But in his silence was a sentence. Joseph had failed. He was no longer useful. The deposition wasn't announced. It was simply enacted. The throne-like trust had vanished. After the fall of Spain, Joseph returned briefly to France, but he no longer belonged. The empire was crumbling. Napoleon's dream of a European dynasty was unraveling. For Joseph, there was nothing left to fight for. He boarded a ship and sailed for America under a false name, settling quietly in New Jersey. The man who had once ruled 2 kingdoms now lived in exile, surrounded not by courtiers or generals, but by trees, books, and the ghost of what might have been. In America, Joseph found a strange kind of peace. He built a modest estate, befriended local elites, and spent his days painting, reading, and walking in the woods. He rarely spoke of his past. He didn't seek sympathy or recognition. Perhaps because he knew deep down that he had been a man out of place. He was never meant to be a king. He was a thinker, not a ruler. A philosopher, not a conqueror. He had been cast into a role he never wanted by a brother who only saw him as a pawn on a vast imperial chessboard. And what of Napoleon? The emperor who once ruled Europe, now ruled nothing. After his defeat in Russia, his enemies closed in. In 1814, he was forced to abdicate and was exiled to the island of Elba. He escaped a year later, returned briefly to power during the 100 Days, but was ultimately defeated at Waterloo in 1815. This time, there was no return. He was sent to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he lived out his days in bitter isolation, his dreams of empire shattered. It is not known if Napoleon ever truly regretted what he did to Joseph. In his memoirs, he occasionally mentioned his brother, sometimes with affection, sometimes with disappointment. But the truth is that the bond between them, once forged in Corsican soil and youthful dreams, had been broken by ambition, by pride, by the cruelty of empire. Napoleon may have believed he was building a dynasty, but in the process, he destroyed the very family he tried to elevate. Joseph Bonaparte died in 1844, far from Europe, far from power, far from the crown that had once weighed so heavily on his head. He was buried not as a king, but as a man. And perhaps in the end, that was enough. So why did Napoleon depose his brother? Because he valued loyalty more than love. Because he mistook gentleness for weakness. Because in his obsession with glory, he couldn't see that Joseph was never meant to be molded into a monarch. And perhaps most tragically, because the empire he built had no room for the fragile, imperfect humanity of those who loved him most. It was not war that tore them apart. It was the crown. And in chasing it, Napoleon lost not just a kingdom, but a brother. Thanks for watching.